Do we really need a pope? This is an abridged version of Father Daniel Poovannathil's speech, Do We Actually Need a Pope? During the recent months, there has been a rising concern among the Catholic Christians around the world about the current Pope Francis, His Holiness, especially because of the Holy Father's liberal views and gestures. Let us discuss whether our Lord Jesus needed such a leadership for his church, whether the concept of Pope is in fact based on the Holy Bible. Jesus brought his disciples to the district of Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16:18. This place is away from Jerusalem, the holy city according to Jews. The district of Caesarea Philippi is mostly a Gentile land. Jesus had a particular intention while bringing his disciples here. As Jesus is a good teacher, he wanted to give them a visual representation of the teachings he was about to give. He wanted them to understand it accurately because it was very important. The then Caesarea Philippi had a temple dedicated to the Greek god Pan. The temple was built on a huge rock or mountain, and at its bottom there was a dark cave that descends abruptly to a vast depth holding huge quantity of water at immeasurable depth, which was often called the gates of hell. Now it is beside this temple Jesus asks his disciples, Who do people say the Son of Man is? They said, Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. It is the first time in the history of Israel someone is named Peter. Peter meaning rock. Jesus is naming Simon Peter, and in the background we see the dark cave and the temple of Pan, which is built on a rock. Jesus proclaims that the Son of the living God will build his church on this rock named Peter, and that no gates of hell would prevail against it. This is the status of Saint Peter, this human before the Son of the living God. The church is being built on this person, or in other words, the very foundation of the Holy Church is laid on an individual. Jesus willed his church to be on an individual, then Saint Peter, and thereafter his successors. Yet another interesting fact is that the Greek god Pan, he is half goat and half man, and according to the ancient Greek religion and mythology, he is the god of the wild, shepherds, and flocks. It is in front of this temple of Pan, who is the god of shepherds and flocks, that Jesus announces Simon, Simon, son of Jonah, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And later, after his resurrection before his ascension, Jesus asks Peter whether he loves him 3 times and charges him to feed his lambs, tend his sheep, and to feed his sheep. Jesus thus formally appoints leaves charge of his flock to a shepherd until he comes again. In Caesarea Philippi, Jesus brought his disciples in front of a temple of a Greek pagan god that was built on a rock. Jesus reinstates that he is not just any other god or one of the prophets, but he is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and his temple is the church, and Peter is the rock on which it would be built. Even the Jerusalem temple was built on a rock, the rock on which our father Abraham laid Isaac to be God's sacrifice. Jesus, in a way, says that the time of pagan gods and its temples are over. The time of Jerusalem temple being built on a special rock is over. Now is the time for a real church, my church, to be built on the foundations of a special human person. Now, the second aspect is Jesus proclaims, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. According to the Jewish tradition, it was the royal steward, the second in command to the king, who was in charge of the most important keys of the kingdom: the palace, the treasury, and the city gate. This key was called as the key of the house of David, or the key of the kingdom of David. It is to be noted that with whom this key to the kingdom of David is. Is it with David? No. Is it with the king? No. It is with the royal steward. He is the custodian. He is the one who opens and closes. Yet during the time of Jesus, the Jews didn't have a king who was in the lineage of King David, yet no royal steward. The person who was in between the God and the people was the high priest, Caiaphas. However, Caiaphas theoretically loses his status and privilege as the high priest once he tears his clothes. Matthew chapter 26, verse 65. Because according to the traditional belief of Jews, the high priest loses his divine favor and status if his hair is unkept or he tears his clothes. Leviticus chapter 10 verse 6 and chapter 21 verse 10. To this position, Jesus elevates Simon Peter to be the leader of his church and shepherd to his flock. The prophecy in the book of Isaiah, chapter 22, 15 verses 24, bear witness to this. According to the divine will, Jesus is the king in the lineage of King David, and his kingdom will never end. Luke chapter 1:33. And Jesus appoints his royal steward to tend his flock, for he knows that he would leave this earth soon. He gives the keys to the kingdom of heaven to his royal steward and proclaims, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. The painting in the Sistine Chapel, Vatican, The Delivery of the Keys, by the artist Perugino, is most often read as Christ handing over the keys of the kingdom of heaven to Saint Peter. In fact, it can also be read as Saint Peter handing the keys back over to Jesus during his second coming. A question may arise in our mind that isn't it Saint Peter who was appointed as the leader of the church? What about Pope Francis? It goes without saying that Jesus was instituting an office by appointing Saint Peter as the first one to adorn it. The last aspect to consider is the papal infallibility. What is papal infallibility? The doctrine of papal infallibility is that in virtue of the promise of Jesus to Peter, the Pope is preserved from the possibility of error when, in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole of the Church. In simple terms, the Pope is protected by God from making mistakes when speaking about faith, morality, or doctrines to be held by the whole Church. We often confuse the charism of papal infallibility with impeccability. It doesn't mean the Pope doesn't sin or commit mistakes. We know from Bible that even Saint Peter fails Jesus a couple of times after Jesus appoints him to be the leader of the church. The first instance is surprisingly right after the joyous occasion. Jesus even rebukes Saint Peter for speaking against God's divine will. The second time is when Saint Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Did these stop Jesus from handing over the church to Saint Peter? We see yet another instance in which Saint Peter, due to his lack of faith, he sinks into the sea while walking over to Jesus. In all of these instances, they are his personal opinions and matters related to his personal life and faith. Yes, a pope can go wrong in estimating the distance between Toronto and New York. It is neither an exercise of his apostolic authority nor defining a doctrine that is to be held by the whole of the Church. Even though the Church has had its dark times and very bad popes, for 2000 years there has not been a single instance in which the Pope has gone wrong in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians and while carrying out his supreme apostolic authority to define a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. Because he is protected by the Holy Spirit in these aspects not to err. This is papal infallibility. We also know that all of Jesus' apostles were simple human beings and not angels. They sinned too. But it is from these sinners God, through His Holy Spirit, brought forth the Gospels, His divine love and wisdom. Therefore, it is not the virtue of human beings as a person that matters, but the virtue of the divine wisdom. Yet another final aspect to ponder is the seed of Moses. Let's read the Holy Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat." Now, did Moses have any seat? What is the mention of the seat? Did the Israelites carry around a seat for Moses while they wandered in the deserts? Then what is the seed of Moses? In the religio-traditional books of the Jews like Talmud, Midrash, and Mishnah, this aspect is clearly explained. While Moses descended from Mount Sinai, he came down with 3 possessions. 1. The commandments, which was written. 2. The oral law, the instructions that God presented to Moses in oral form by speech. This was passed on as oral tradition until it was written down in AD 2. And third, the teaching authority. This is what Jews called the Moses' seat. We read in the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew in chapter 23 that Jesus condemns the ways of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Jesus says they tie up heavy loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. Do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Yet, Jesus says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. Jesus supersedes this authority, the teaching authority, the Moses' seat, to Saint Peter and his seat to papacy. And that's the reason why he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Jesus instructs us to follow whatever is taught, exercising the authority of the Moses' seat. However, we need not imitate their actions. In conclusion, yes, St. Peter sank in water, but there is Jesus beside him to hold his hand, and they even walk together and boards the boat again. After all, papacy is the longest existing office in the world, with an uninterrupted history of more than 2000 years. We need not worry about the actions of any pope. Firstly, we are no one to judge. Secondly, we need not imitate their actions, but only follow whatever is taught, exercising the authority of the Moses' seat. I will clothe him with your robe and fasten your sash around him and hand your authority over to him. He will be a father to those who live in Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. Isaiah chapter 22, verse 21.